Voilà, cap à présent sur notre deuxième sujet de cette matinée.
Well, our focus on our second lead story today. Kenya, Green East Africa and Angola have joined the fray of countries of concern on the watch list of CIVICUS, a global monitoring network of civic and human rights, as the two countries face their presidential polls in August. Now, in Angola, the group has raised concern the country is still oppressing protesters and using force on peaceful demonstrations, while in Kenya, restrictions have always been placed on activists and bloggers for publishing dissenting articles.
Authorities in both countries have tightened their grip on the civil society. Angolan authorities have increased restrictions on freedom of expression and peaceful assembly, while in Kenya, critical civil society groups have been targeted through unjustified restrictions on associational freedoms and subjected to death threats, forcing several of them to go into hiding. Tanzania has also been added to the watch list because of the recent attacks on the media, the civil society and the LGBTI community. The new report indicates that the assault on basic freedoms in the country has been driven from the very top, with the recent statements from President John Magufuli warning the media to be careful. Let's talk about this with Cartel Gilbert, the director for the CIVICUS Group Monitor, joining us from Dublin in Ireland. Thanks for joining us in today's program. How did Kenya, Tanzania and Angola get on the watch list of countries where there are serious and ongoing threats to civic space?
What we mean by this is that in practice, there are issues which affect people in these countries and organizations in these countries and their ability to organize into groups, to demonstrate peacefully on the streets, and to freely express their views and opinions. It doesn't mean that these countries have got the worst conditions for civic space. It simply means that there are issues right now which we would like to draw countries and the world's attention to. So in Angola, what we've seen in recent weeks is an upsurge in repression, particularly against journalists. In Kenya, similarly there, we've seen increasingly hostile conditions for journalists in the lead up to those elections. We've also seen some threats made against civil society organizations and others who say that if there are any calls for mass action or forms of protest, there could be potential arrest, something which is in violation of Kenya's international obligations and the universal standard to protect people's rights to peacefully protest. Finally, we've added Tanzania to the watch list because we would like to draw attention to what is happening there relative to, again, the media, the threats to the media, and also to LGBTI people.
And are these threats becoming more during the roundup to the elections in Kenya and Angola, for instance, or there has been a growing phenomenon?
In Kenya, we've been concerned about the threats to civic space for some time. There is definitely a tense atmosphere in the run-up to the elections for civil society. As we all know, previous elections in Kenya have become violent. Our contacts on the ground in Kenya tell us that it's not necessarily the case that there will be violence during these elections. However, there has definitely been an attempt by the authorities to constrain the activities of civil society organizations, particularly around the elections themselves. And we're particularly concerned about what might happen in the aftermath of an election if the result is disputed and if civil society organizations were to take to the streets in support perhaps of a recount or in opposition to what they might perceive to be unfair administration of the polls.
A last question, Katal. We have seen a growing number of governments clamp down on the civil society and their dissenting voices. What impact does this have on the societies?
It is an extremely worrying trend. I should point out that, of course, it's not just a trend in the African continent. Our recent results that we released in April showed that civic space is pretty respected in only 3%. For only 3% of the world's population. So it really is a global problem that we see leaders in both democratic countries and authoritarian countries viewing civil society as a threat to their power, their control over society, and somehow as destabilizing factors, when in fact history has shown again and again that it is through society, through voluntary, peaceful efforts, that humanity is able to solve its biggest problems. And so I think it's high time for leaders on the continent and internationally who do value civil society to come to civil society's defense, and to be able to speak out when you do have leaders who portray civil society as the enemy,